At dawn in Sidon, a car was hit on the seaside promenade beside two cafes, with customers still inside. The number carrying this story across the region was 8 dead and 28 wounded, and that is why the title hits like it does. Not because a strike happened, but because it happened in a public place where ordinary life was still trying to exist. This was the moment the word truce started sounding fake. In the same city, displaced children were sitting on a truck with their belongings, waiting to learn whether the ceasefire would include Lebanon and let them go home. That image takes this story out of the studio and puts it where it belongs, inside the lives of people who were not asking for theory, only for one answer. Are we safe enough to return or not? Sidon got its answer in the worst possible way. After the strike, a man was left inspecting the wreckage of a cafe in Sidon. That is the image that should stay in the viewer's head, because it caches the title immediately, Cafe Impact Aftermath, and a truce hanging over all of it, like a bad joke. Once a cafe becomes the proof, nobody can hide this story behind safe language anymore. If you want the layer beneath the headline, instead of the recycled headline itself, subscribe now, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what happened in Sidon is exactly the kind of story that exposes who hears diplomacy and who lives under the fire behind it. At least 8 people were killed when Israel struck Sidon on April 8th, and the blast ripped straight through the political atmosphere of a supposed regional pause. That is the first hard fact. The second is what gives the title its real force. These deaths landed after the region had already started being pushed to think in terms of truce, which means that the promise of de-escalation and the reality on the ground were already splitting apart. So the real question is not whether Sidon was hit. The real question is whether this was a strike that happened after a truce, or proof that Lebanon was never really inside the truce at all. That is the click. That is what the audience came for. Not a vague Middle East tensions continue lecture, but the answer to a harder question. If there was a pause, then why did a cafe in Sidon still end up looking like part of an and active war zone? Then the sentence arrived that rewired the whole story. The 2-week ceasefire, Israel said, did not include Lebanon. That means the public heard the word truce, but Lebanon was being told in the same breath that its front was still live, still targetable, still outside the safety. People naturally attach to that word. That is why the title works so violently. After the truce is not just about timing, it is about betrayal. The region was hearing one political message, while Sidon was receiving another with explosive force. And once you understand that, the Sidon Cafe strike stops looking like a tragic contradiction and starts looking like a brutal clarification. The truce had boundaries. Lebanon was on the wrong side of them. The contradiction hardened almost immediately. Israel backed the US ceasefire with Iran, but made clear it would not stop fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, and those operations continued through the morning. So one front was being cooled for diplomatic reasons, while another front was left burning hard enough to keep producing strikes, casualties, and fear. That is not some technical misunderstanding. That is selective de-escalation. And selective de-escalation is one of the ugliest forms of war management, because it lets leaders say the temperature is falling while civilians in the excluded theater are still standing in the heat. This is also why a weaker script would lose the audience right here. If you soften the contradiction too early, you drain the title. What the audience needs to feel is simple and sharp. A truce was being talked about, but Lebanon was still being handled as expendable space. The Lebanese army then warned civilians not to return to southern villages and towns because ongoing Israeli attacks could still expose them to danger. That warning matters as much as the strike itself. It tells you the ceasefire was not real enough to travel home under, not real enough to rebuild around, and not real enough to trust with your family's life. And that is where the image of those children on the truck comes back with full force. They were waiting for a diplomatic answer. The battlefield gave them the answer first. This is the deeper cruelty of the story. In capital cities, ceasefires are words. In places like Sidon, ceasefires are tested by whether you can walk, return, sit, wait, or survive. If the answer is no, then the public has already understood something the official language is still trying to conceal. Now we hit the information war layer, and this is where reporting ends and intelligence begins. Israel's military line, carried through contemporaneous coverage, was that the strike targeted Mohammed Abdullah, described as a Hezbollah figure linked to drone deployment and communications. That may be true, partly true, or incomplete, but even if you grant that claim maximum credit, the scene in Sidon does not get cleaner. It gets darker, because a targeted strike beside active cafes on a promenade is still a choice about civilian risk. It is still a choice about timing. And in this case, it was also a choice made in a political window when the region was being told to think the war might be pausing. That is why viewers feel the violence of this story before they even finish processing the facts. The military language says target, the human language says cafe, the strategic language says truce, exclusion. Put those three together and you do not get clarity. You get a far more dangerous picture of how this war is actually being managed. Inside Lebanon, the broader frame was already being stated in blunt terms. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam said that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps were commanding to Hezbollah's operations, which means the Lebanese front was being described as part of the wider regional war system, not some sealed local firefight. That matters because it explains why Lebanon could remain under pressure even while a pause. The track opened elsewhere. And once Lebanon is treated as a live extension of the Iran war, Sidon stops looking like a one-off tragedy at the edge of the map. It starts looking like a pressure point, a place where force can keep talking even while diplomacy claims momentum. That is what the audience does not get from ordinary coverage. Ordinary coverage asks whether the truce is holding. The sharper question is who was never meant to be protected by it. Before Sidon, Israel's government had already declared its intent to establish what it called a permanent security buffer zone in southern Lebanon to push Hezbollah and its rocket arsenal farther from the border. That means this campaign was already operating on a deeper logic than immediate retaliation. The war was already shaping territory, return, and civilian movement long before the Sidon cafe strike ripped into the headlines. That is the escalation layer that keeps this story alive. Sidon is not just a casualty event. It sits inside a campaign that is trying to decide who can come back, which areas remain under threat, and how much of southern Lebanon can be re-engineered in the name of security. Once you see that the strike beside a cafe stops feeling accidental in political meaning, it may still be explained as targeted in military terms, but strategically it functions as a message. Lebanon is still inside the coercive zone. The language got even harsher when Israel Katz said homes in villages near the border in Lebanon would be destroyed according to the model of Rafah and Beit Hanun in Gaza in order to permanently remove threats near the border to northern Israeli residents. That is not narrow counterfire language. That is environment-shaping language. And it tells you civilian space itself is part of the battlefield logic. And when civilian space itself becomes part of battlefield logic, then cafes, homes, roads, return routes, and waterfronts all start carrying strategic meaning. A Sidon cafe after the truce is no longer just a heartbreaking image. It becomes evidence of what kind of war this is. This is exactly why YouTube viewers either lean forward or click away. They lean forward when the story keeps revealing a deeper stake, and the deeper stake here is unmistakable. The war in Lebanon was not simply continuing. It was being kept available as leverage. International peacekeepers had already reported Israeli troops and activities in multiple locations inside southern Lebanon, while airstrikes and other air activities continued. So Sidon did not erupt out of a calm environment suddenly broken by one incident. It landed inside an already active pattern of military pressure, which makes the truce but not Lebanon formula look less like confusion and more like policy. That point matters because it kills the comforting fiction that the gap between diplomacy and violence was accidental. The machinery was already on. The strike in Sidon simply made the contradiction impossible to ignore. Now bring the human cost back in, because this script cannot become all architecture and no pulse. The audience clicked for a humanly violent truth, not a white paper on regional sequencing. In Tyre, another civilian describing another strike said the blast came at 2:10 p.m. and the clock had stood still since then. That line belongs in this story because it captures the real condition of southern Lebanon right now. Political time may move with announcements and pauses, but civilian time freezes at the moment impact enters the room. That is why this video cannot end with some soft line about fragile peace. Fragile peace is what people say when they want to sound balanced. Frozen clocks, displaced children, return warnings, and a blasted cafe in Sidon say something much harder. Humanitarian teams on the ground put the civilian truth into words with brutal precision. How is this still happening? And how are people expected to live with destruction, displacement, and constant fear as the new normal? That is not commentary from a distance. That is the lived meaning of being told the region is entering a pause while your own reality keeps arriving as blast, warning, and displacement. And now the close has to do what the whole script was built to do. It has to answer the central question without hiding behind easy certainty. If the Israeli target claim is true, then Sidon shows a war doctrine willing to carry out lethal action in a public civilian environment at the exact moment a ceasefire narrative was rising over the region. In that version, the truce was real for some theaters, but not real enough to restrain what was still considered necessary in Lebanon. If that target claim is false, exaggerated, or strategically stretched, then the implication gets darker, not softer. Then the strike becomes even more direct, proof that Lebanon excluded was not technical wording at all. It was operational permission delivered through force. Either way, one conclusion survives. Lebanon was not experiencing the truce the way the truce was being sold. That is the answer to the title. That is the audience payoff. Israel hits Sidon Cafe 8 dead, 28 wounded after the truce is not just a breaking headline. It is a map. It shows exactly where the pause ended, exactly who was left outside it, and exactly how that exclusion was communicated. Those children on the truck in Sidon were waiting to learn whether Lebanon had been included. The strike, the warning, and the aftermath answered them faster than any negotiator ever could. Stay subscribed. This channel tracks the moment official language breaks and reality takes over.